Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's webinar, Rethinking Preservation in Urban Settings. I also want to say thank you to the sponsor of our Future of Preservation webinar series, the Peggy N. and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you found your way to this webinar but are not yet familiar with the League, we are New York's statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. The League does this work in every corner of New York State in lots of different ways, including offering technical services, providing grants, our 7 to Save list of endangered historic sites. We do public policy and advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels. We have our Excellence in Historic Preservation Award, celebrating the best in our field, and we are currently accepting nominations. So if you know of some excellent preservation, please send them our way. And we also have a whole slate of online programs, including webinars like this one. I do want to let you know that if you are an architect and you would like continuing education credits for attending today's webinar, you can do that. Just DM me in the chat or send me an email. Let me know who you are and which webinar you are attending, and we will make sure to get that squared away for you. Today's webinar will be focused on rethinking preservation in urban settings. And what we mean by that is really, every city is different, every city has its own challenges, but there are overlaps in how we think about preservation in those kinds of places. And we really want to kind of bust ourselves out of the box of what we traditionally think of as preservation. So in cases where landmarking or historic tax credits don't necessarily work or aren't enough, like what are some other ways that preservation can really be beneficial to our neighborhoods and our communities? So from cultural districts to building shell stabilization, there are many different ways that preservationists can engage with complicated realities of urban centers to better serve the people who live and work there. And so we have a few really great examples of that to share with you today from our panel, including work being done in Newburgh, like you see in the bottom picture here, and Little Manila, Queens, which you see in the top photo. And so our panel today is going to consist of Chris Cirillo, who has graciously agreed to moderate for us. He's the Executive Director and President of the Ascendant Neighborhood Development Corporation. The League has worked with Ascendant a lot over the last few years through our grant programs and their work in East Harlem, working to survey and landmark buildings and districts there. Christiana Limniatis, who is the Director of Preservation Services from Preservation Buffalo Niagara. Liz McEnaney, co-founder of Building Shells, Building Community in Newburgh, and also co-founder of the Hudson Valley Collaborative. And Xenia Diente, co-founder of Little Manila, Queens Bayanihan Arts. And so we're very excited to have them here today. Before I hand it over to Chris to kind of intro the topic, I did want to let you know that if you need captions for today's program, you can enable those through the taskbar in your Zoom window. This webinar is also being recorded, so if you can't stay for the whole thing or just love it so much and you want to share it with all your friends, we encourage you to do that. You can find it on our YouTube channel within the next day or so. It's also being live streamed on our Facebook page, so you can find it there as well. If you have questions during the panel's presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box. The chat will be open for general comments. If you want to tell us where you're tuning in from, we would love to hear that, so drop that in the chat. But if you have questions that you would like our panelists to answer, please drop them in the Q&A, and Chris will make sure to get to as many of them as possible during the group discussion after each of our individual panelists' presentations. So with that, I am going to disappear and hand it over to Chris to get us started. Are you there, Chris?
I am here, but I can't turn on my video. I think you need to allow me to turn on my video. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for the introduction and the invitation to participate and moderate the panel today. I'm really excited about what our panelists are going to be presenting on. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It is very much a part of what we focus on at Ascendant Neighborhood Development in our work in East Harlem, as well as our participation in a neighborhood alliance called Landmark East Harlem, where we have spent the last several years working to identify, celebrate, and protect the historic resources of the very rich history of East Harlem. And I think similar to all of our panelists, the communities that we're going to be hearing about today and the work that we're going to be hearing about today is really focused on expanding the practice of preservation in urban areas and urban neighborhoods, getting beyond, as Katie said, simply designation and historic tax credit projects, but really looking at other ways and other tools that we can bring to use in these situations where either those other tools, the more traditional preservation tools, just kind of don't serve the purposes that we need in those communities. So I'm really excited, having had a preview of what our panelists are going to talk about today. I'm really excited to introduce all of them and get them started on their presentations. So a little bit about the logistics for the panel. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, share some images and context for the work that they're doing and the communities where they're doing it. And then after our third presentation, we'll come back together as a group and discuss some common themes that have emerged from our conversations about this work, and then open it up for Q&A from the audience. So let me start by introducing our three panelists for today. First up, we're going to hear from Christiana Limniatis, who is the Director of Preservation Services at Preservation Buffalo Niagara in Buffalo, New York. At PBN, Christiana oversees all technical and community services which work to expand and strengthen the reach of preservation, education, and best practices in Western New York. Originally from Albany, New York, Christiana began her preservation career at Historic Albany Foundation and has also worked as a preservation consultant in Louisiana and Tennessee. Christiana holds a BA in History and Political Science from the College of St. Rose and completed her coursework towards an MA in Historic Preservation Planning at Cornell University. After Christiana, we'll hear from Liz McEnaney, who's a preservationist and nonprofit leader. She is co-founder of the Hudson Valley Collaborative, a woman-led design collaborative that works with communities on design, planning, and preservation projects in the Hudson Valley region and beyond. Previously, Liz served as executive director of Sir John Soane's Museum Foundation. Prior to this, she was the executive director and later a board member of the SS Columbia Project, a nonprofit organization restoring a 1902-built National Historic Landmark steamboat. Liz is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She is active in preservation efforts in Newburgh, New York, and is a founding trustee of Awesome Newburgh and on the board of the Fullerton Center. She also serves on the boards of Project Hello World and the Historic Districts Council in New York City. And our final presenter today is Xenia Diente, a Queens-based artist, cultural organizer, and public art administrator who specializes in the field of public art. She oversees the New York City Department of Design and Construction's public art program as public art deputy director with over 20 years of public service. She works extensively with the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs Percent for Art program, supporting visual artists to design, fabricate, and install public art in civic facilities and infrastructure. Xenia is active in her neighborhood of Woodside, Queens, and is the founder of the Little Manila Queens Bayanihan Arts, a collaboration between artists and cultural workers who support community-based arts and creative placekeeping efforts by and for the diasporic Filipino community in Woodside, Queens, as well as the greater New York City area. She serves on the executive board of the Filipino American National Historical Society Metro New York chapter. Xenia holds a BFA from the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art and Coro Leadership New York. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Christiana for our first presentation about her work with Preservation Buffalo Niagara.
Hi, hello everybody. Welcome and thank you for having me. I hope that you enjoy my ridiculously happy looking rainbows and cloud template for a presentation today. Serious topic, so we needed a goofy image, right? So I'm a preservationist. Before we can really understand and how we're going to solve a solution, we need to understand the context of how we have this problem. So again, to better understand how we can engage with the complicated realities of our built environment, we need to have that context to understand how our built environment got complicated. White Euro-American settlers began arriving in the area that is now known as Buffalo in the mid-18th century. But long before that, and still today, these lands are home to the Haudenosaunee Nation and peoples. The Treaty of Canandaigua of 1794 protected that right to the land, but in 1797, the Treaty of Big Tree effectively extinguished that indigenous title to the lands beginning at all the lands west of the Genesee River, with the exception of small designated reservations. It's that same year, after stealing the land from the Haudenosaunee, that Joseph Ellicott was contracted by the Holland Land Company to survey the company's land in Western New York. He's responsible for our radial grid that we still have today. But in those beginning years, it's very quiet, and then the Erie Canal changes everything. We're at about a population of 2,000 when it's being built. 5 years later, we jump to 8,000 in population. By 1900, we are the 8th largest city in the United States. We are the 6th busiest water port in the world, and we have a population of almost 400,000. I could rattle off a million other little things, life-altering inventions, groundbreaking scientific and medical discoveries, and internationally significant events, but we do not have time. But please enjoy this incredibly packed picture of Main Street. I mean, Buffalo was the cat's pajamas. Everyone wanted to be here. But every high has a low. Things started to go down in the post-war period. Population continues to grow slightly. We hit our peak in 1950 at 500,000 or almost 600,000. But the St. Lawrence Seaway just kind of decimates Buffalo's port. It bypasses the need for stopping in Buffalo, and that just creates a huge explosion of the industry in town. Many horrible decisions were made, making huge gashes on our built environment. On the right-hand side, you'll see the construction of the Kensington Expressway. It was one of the former parkways of the Olmsted Park system. At this time, it was a vibrant neighborhood of primarily Black and brown residents. So of course, it made it the perfect location to bulldoze dozens of blocks for a highway to facilitate affluent white suburbanites to get to and from their job. And on the left-hand side, you'll see one of the many architectural gems, sorry, it's pixelated, that were demolished in the name of progress, either for big, pipe dream kind of projects or many, many parking lots. Here's just one of the many examples. It just kind of shows the level of destruction that happened in the city of Buffalo. Left hand, 1927 aerial view of Ellicott District, almost 8,000 people living there. Yes, it's definitely a lot of tenement housings, not the best conditions, probably not a lot of running water, but you can see that high level density and how many people are actually living in that area. And then by 1963, it's literally all erased. Generations of Buffalonians in that neighborhood, a primarily Black and brown neighborhood, have just been wiped away. And the housing that replaced it, you can see those project towers, was not properly maintained, did not have the steady funding. And so it was incredibly substandard housing very, very quickly. So it's bad for a really long time, and then things start to slowly start happening, and people start calling it a renaissance. Personally, I find that slightly offensive to the people, the hundreds of community leaders and organizers and activists who never stopped working to support the city and their community, and the hundreds of thousands of individuals that did not flee, that did stay here, and want to improve Buffalo. In this Renaissance period, we have to mention the role that historic tax credits have played. According to the National Park Service, between 2002 and 2015, $3.8 billion of tax credit funding was spent in New York State. During that time period, Buffalo was one of the top users of that tax credit. So we were really a part of that, not just the Renaissance here in Buffalo, but across New York State. Governor Cuomo, #2, gave us the Buffalo Billions project, where they plan to invest $1 billion in our economy. A lot of those projects have been great, some of them not so great. But in this Renaissance, and leading to what we're doing in this community, we have to understand that this Renaissance is not reaching everybody. We can see here in this map on the left-hand side is that HOLC map showing the redlined areas, that red line showing where Main Street is. So the east side of Main Street is primarily all 3rd grade and 4th grade, all C and D area. Those are the areas that would not have had access to any sort of financial incentives through banks and traditional methods or traditional means. And we see how that has impacted us still today, where those are the communities now that are primarily low income, primarily minority neighborhoods that are still struggling from that lasting imprint of not being able to access that financial funding. That economic and racial segregation is also present when we look at our preservation efforts, right? So here is a map of the National Register districts and the local historic districts, and we can see quite plainly how the majority of them are on the west side of town and not on the east side of town. I think it's important to understand, we focus a lot on that conversation of the disparities between where these designations are because of, it must be because of the lack of integrity or the issues with integrity, that the East Side has been subject to so many of these disruptive programs that there's been a lot of changes to that infrastructure. So there's certainly conversations about integrity, but we also have to understand that this is a result of preservation professionals' own biases and not thinking and seeing East Side as something that is landmarkable, as something that we should be spending time on. And again, you can see that with the lack of work that's been done on the East Side. And the last quick thing I wanted to say before in this little preamble part is Harris Hardware, RIP. It was demolished in 2019. This was definitely a catalyst building and situation for Preservation Buffalo Niagara, that this was, a perfectly rehabable building. It had lots of challenges, but it just could not be done with our traditional opportunities that are available. We tried so desperately. So when this was demolished, Jesse, our previous executive director, and I really hit the ground and was like, we need to come up with new programs so that we avoid a future Harris Hardware demolition. So these are the 4 things that we quickly got working on: our Sacred Spaces program, our loan fund, our stabilization fund, and our new updated strategic plan. So our Sacred Spaces Assistance Program provides technical assistance to religious and nonprofit organizations to pursue National Register listings as part of their work to rehabilitate and preserve their historic structures. As everybody, I'm sure, is aware on this call, there's restrictions on what kind of funding religious institutions can access. And so almost every single grant out there to secure National Register status that they could apply to get money to hire a consultant is not available to them. So this fills that need of the dozens of underused and vacant sacred spaces on the East Side to be able to get this assistance to at least get that National Register eligibility or status so they can get on that path to accessing the funding that is available to them. You can see here our laundry list of who's on our docket right now and the successes we've had in various designations. We're almost finished with our first National Register nomination to come out of this project, which would be for St. John the Baptist on Hurdle Avenue. Our second program is a revolving loan fund that was started in 2019 with a gift from a very generous supporter in his estate. We also got money from the 1772 Foundation and a few anonymous donors. Our first loan was for the African Heritage Food Co-op. That is a drawing of what the building will eventually look like. We provided them funding to stabilize 238 Carlton, and they are well on their way. Actually, I'm really proud to announce that they actually just paid back their loan this week. We're so very excited for Alex and his team to get to that next stage. There is a huge food desert, food apartheid issue on the East Side. And so that was really a priority for us to use this funding that we had to solve some of those problems, not just to get buildings that we wanted fixed, but to solve some of those other social issues that we experience on the East Side. Our third program was the East Side Commercial Building Stabilization Fund. This is definitely a heavy lift program and wasn't just something that we did on our own. It's a partnership with the East Side Avenues program of Empire State Development and the University of Buffalo Regional Institute. It is a $5 million stabilization fund to help protect fabric, density, character, and communities on the East Side. This was literally born from Jesse Fisher, our previous executive director, literally going to every single community meeting that the state held on what would eventually become this East Side Avenues program, and just broken record, we need a stabilization fund, we need a stabilization fund, we need a stabilization fund. And we finally got that with them and are currently working through that. The spirit and intent of this program is to provide funding for smaller seal-up efforts, including roof patching, mothballing precautions, and other preventative repairs to avoid those short-sighted demolitions or emergency demolitions that aren't actually emergencies. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you guys is our updated strategic plan. In this document, we've committed to reforming traditional preservation practices, addressing their inequities, and expanding their reach. And so with the strategic plan and over the next few years, We plan to demonstrate that historic preservation can be fully representative and that saving historic resources can be all kinds can celebrate the region's diverse history, catalyze economic development, support environmental sustainability, advance social justice, and contribute to the health and well-being of our greater community. And that is everything I wanted to tell y'all. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Christiana. Great presentation. There's a lot to dig into there, and look forward to hearing the questions that come about the work that you're doing in Buffalo. So now we will turn it over to Liz McEnaney, who's going to speak about her work in the city of Newburgh.
And unmute myself. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to be speaking about a project called Building Shells, Building Community, which is a project that I've been working on in Newburgh for the past 3 years. I'm going to give a shout out to my project partner on this, Naomi Herson-Ringskog, and the Fullerton Center. And the Fullerton is a nonprofit organization in Newburgh. It's entirely volunteer-led, but that's really, that organization has been spearheading this project. So it's thanks to the board members and everyone else in the community that we have been talking to and working with on this project that we are at the stage that we're at now. And I see from some comments in the chat that there are some people that I know from Newburgh, so great to have everyone on this call and eager to have your comments in the Q&A. So I'm just going to be very quick, give a very quick overview on Newburgh. Hopefully some of you have been there. If not, we're always welcoming people to come and we'll give tours. But this is Broadway in Newburgh. Since we're talking about rethinking preservation today, I just wanted to say that historic preservation efforts in Newburgh are not new. This is the Hasbrouck House, or what is known as Washington's headquarters. And this was purchased by New York State in 1850 and became the first publicly owned historic site in the United States. Newburgh also has one of the largest historic districts in New York State. I think it's only Brooklyn Heights that has a larger contiguous historic district. So this is the city's East End Historic District, which was designated part designated in 1973, expanded in 1985, but it contains over 2,400 contributing structures and covers about 445 acres. And this is in a city that's only about 4 square acres large. So in many ways, urban renewal spurred the establishment and creation of the historic district that I just showed you. Newburgh, like many of the cities in the Hudson Valley, Poughkeepsie, Albany, Kingston, suffered tremendously during urban renewal. So this is just an image showing the 50 acres or 1,300 buildings that were lost during urban renewal. So it was really the pressure of this in part that led to the establishment of the historic district. So if urban renewal was a driver of preservation efforts in the 70s and even early 80s, what's driving preservation in the city today? So I wanted to just start by looking at Newburgh today. So here's the breakdown of Newburgh's demographics today. The city is just over 28,000 people. 50% of the population is from Latin American countries, such as Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. 20% of the population is Black, and this is a population that has been in decline for the past decade. Here are a few other stats. I just want to point out that about 25% of Newburgh's population lives below the poverty line. There are many people and many organizations, including people on the call today, who are spearheading preservation efforts in the city of Newburgh. So this is residents of Newburgh out at Old Town Cemetery, established in 1713, working on cleaning up the graveyard. So there are efforts like this. There are homeowners who are rehabilitating properties. There are business owners who have been committed to Newburgh for decades and have property and are restoring those and kind of creating the commercial streetlight of Newburgh. So there's a lot going on, and there are a lot of people who are a part of what's happening there. So today I'm just going to talk about one project, and this is, again, one in many, many projects that are happening in Newburgh right now. So the Fullerton, specifically Naomi and I have been focusing our efforts these past 3 years on looking at the city's building shells. So in 2015, the city of Newburgh undertook a study and counted that there were about 700 vacant buildings. Today, that number's dwindled to below 200. But of those 200 vacancies, there is an unknown number that were so damaged and weathered that they barely stood. And these are the building shells. So what is a building shell? Building shells are really blighted structures that lack floors and roof plates, or floor plates and roofs, I should say. They're sometimes more generally referred to as vacant buildings or zombie buildings. But in the course of our research on thinking about Newburgh's building shells, what we didn't realize when we started this project was that New York State actually has a property tax classification for these types of buildings. So you can see here, we've just listed it, but 351 is a residential shell building. 352 is a commercial shell building. So while, as many of you know, sometimes it's really hard to figure out how you measure or the number of vacancies in a given community, determining the number of building shells is a little bit clearer because you just look at the property tax classifications and you can determine that. So Newburgh has about 32 building shells right now that fall into this category. This building shells classification is used in not every city in New York State. There's a number of cities, particularly in Western New York, that are using this. But I flag this because we see this as a potential opportunity, that there is a property tax classification and there's a way of identifying these buildings that, you know, possibly could there be some state funding that is specifically targeted towards this typology. This is something that we'd like to explore further. But moving on beyond what is a building shell. So when we first started looking at this project 3 years ago, our original research question was really thinking about how can we bring building shells to kind of a halfway point to disrupt this downward cycle. So we were very much focused on design and technical solutions for how to stabilize buildings. But through our preliminary research there, we realized that a lot of work had already been done thinking about stabilization efforts. A lot had been done nationally, and a lot had been done in other municipalities in New York State, starting to think about stabilization efforts. And in the course of our conversations, I think one thing that really stood out to us was there was a bigger kind of question to get at before thinking about the stabilization, and it was thinking about the community. So we kind of pivoted and we started to think about ways that Newburghers could collectively prevent buildings from becoming shells. So we really were looking at ways that residents and the municipality could work together to identify buildings that are on the path to becoming shells and find out ways to prevent this from happening. So these are just a few photos of some of the building shells in the city. So while we started our preliminary research, we originally focused on 2 building shells as our case studies. And this photo that you're seeing here is an activity that took place in front of one of the building shells. So this was, we worked with a Columbia University architecture students who created this art installation that was a community-based project of making triangles out of boxes and painting them. So everyone painted on these boxes, writing how they felt about building shells. And then we attached this to the fence in front of one of the building shells. But in the course of this was a way to have a conversation. This project launched on the same day that the city of Newburgh had a Love Your Block grant. And that's one of the projects where parts of communities can apply, usually get $1,000. Most of it goes towards a dumpster. Community members come out. It's a big cleanup day, but there is a a DJ, there are refreshments, there's just a lot of people out on the street. So it was a great opportunity for us to meet the neighbors, but also to develop partnerships that have become kind of pivotal to our work. And the gentleman you can see here holding one of the triangles, that's Nick Edwards, that's Newburgh's neighborhood stabilization coordinator. And he really became and still is one of our greatest allies and partners on this project. So we came to learn about the role of neighborhood stabilization coordinator. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with this. We weren't when we started this, but back in 2016, when New York State passed the zombie law, also known as the Abandoned Property Neighborhood Relief Act, to kind of create the database of zombie properties. One of the things that came out of this was there was funding to hire neighborhood stabilization coordinators in communities. So the role of the neighborhood stabilization coordinator varies depending on the municipality. We've worked closely with Nick in Newburgh. We've also gotten to know Sam Wells, who works in Albany. So the work that Sam and Nick do very much dovetails with the work that we were doing in terms of thinking about stabilizing building shells. So neighborhood stabilization coordinators often think about things like going out in the community and making sure that residents have estate planning, because oftentimes buildings become shells due to someone passes away and suddenly, there was no will, the building is in probate court, and that's when the downward cycle begins. They also work on Love Your Block types of programs of big community cleanups as a way of talking to residents about basic techniques for repairing stoops or making minor repairs, or kind of demystifying the building codes process and making it less of a stigma to get a code, but more be teaching them kind of the city is there as a resource to help them pay for this and kind of move forward. So the idea of working with the neighborhood stabilization coordinator very much appealed to us, given the fact that our goals were aligned. So that's been a great asset to us of learning from Nick in Newburgh and also becoming part of this larger network and learning about what's happening in other municipalities. So we met Nick through this one initiative. And after that, we kind of synthesized our research and developed this community toolkit, which is available on the Fullerton website, which I'll put up at the end of this presentation. But the toolkit really looks at some of the causes of what causes a building to become a shell. And it also looks at what actions the community members can take, kind of small scale actions and larger scale actions. So this came out of all this research. But we realized the toolkit wasn't enough. We weren't able to get the toolkit into the hands of the residents that we wanted to share this information with. So we launched a series of walking tours. So you can see in the image on the right, our tour guide, the wonderful Steve Baltzis from Newburgh, is on the left. He's been writing up tours and leading them in the city of Newburgh. And the tours have really focused on 4 streets in Newburgh that I'd say are somewhat overlooked corridors. They're not the corridors that have the A.J. Davis or Thornton Nivens buildings, but they're really some of the corridors that have incredible architectural details and often tell the stories of Newburgh's social history and immigrant history. So we've launched this tour program, and this is a way Steve talks about the history, but also shares a lot of the information that is included in the toolkit. If you can't make it to Newburgh, a lot of the information in Steve's tour is on the Urban Archive app, which you can Google Urban Archive and access this. This just shows kind of the Urban Archive map, so you can see how many points of information about Newburgh buildings are now populated there. So while doing all of this, we still were focused on these case studies. So this is the case study building we were looking at in Newburgh, 13 to 15 South Johnson Street. And you can see that this is a building shell. It's the 3 buildings. It had been, I'll show you a little bit of the history of some of the images we were able to find. So, we did FOIL requests to find out, to look at the number of building violations and to just understand what happened to this building and how it fell into disrepair. So just getting a sense of some of the similar, as we foiled a number of buildings, we started to see the similarities, and a lot of them are tied up in court cases and probate issues of other things like that. So we launched a design competition to rethink this building shell. This was in part with the James Marston Fitch Foundation and funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. So we launched the call. We had over 50 applicants who were submitted proposals to rethink the shells. So the winning design was Joshua Zhao of Zhao Architects. And Joshua is creating a porch pavilion, which will actually be in the adjacent lot next to the building shell. In the course of doing this, we realized that the building shell we were looking at was far more fragile than we had initially realized. So what we're doing is Joshua is thinking about Newburgh's the building typologies in Newburgh and the idea of the porch. And AJ Davis working in Newburgh, from an early point in time, the porch was important in Newburgh's architectural history. So we're rethinking the porch as a gathering space. And this summer into fall, we'll be launching workshops addressing some of the basic issues. So we've been talking to members of Newburgh's Architectural Review Commission to try to understand what some of the pain points are in going before the review commission, and how perhaps we could organize some workshops in English and Spanish that help address some of these basic needs. Also, we have launched a program called Look Mira, Building Design Literacy. So we've just hired an intern who's going to be working with us to do research on and to help us figure out how best to reach out to Newburgh's Latino population and structure some events this summer and into the fall in Spanish to kind of engage people in a conversation about preservation. And then we're also going to continue this summer and fall.
Popping up to give you a time warning.
Oh, thank you, Katie. Okay, we're continuing walking towards other things like that, but you can check out the Fullerton's website for more information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. And now we're going to bring on our third panelist, Xenia Diente, to speak about her work in Woodside, Queens.
Thank you. Let me figure out how to share my screen. Okay. Can you see it? Can you see the screen?
Yes, Xenia, you're in a presenter mode, so you can see your notes too.
Oh, darn it. Okay. Was hoping to, okay, let me wing it. But thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Preservation League of New York State, for inviting me here today. I am not my background is public art. And I'm gonna just share some of the work that we've been doing here in Little Manila, here in Woodside, Queens in New York City. I'll start off with a 3-minute video by Brian Redondo.
Your favorite song, night is young. You got me going on every single beat. If my heart's so deep, you wrap my arms around you, cause you sweep me off my feet. We have little Manila right here in Woodside, on very own. I'm so Queens, like this is my whole life.
Xenia, the sound isn't quite working on the video.
Little Manila Queens really is where I found community here in New York City.
I'm so excited that we have a place to call our own, you know, Little Manila. It's like putting a spot on the map for us.
Marking that we are here allows us to preserve that history, preserve the joys, preserve our sacrifices, preserve even the mundane every day.
Thank you. My apologies if the sound was choppy, but starting here, I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about my story through my family story, and this photo is my Lola Esther de Vocal. She studied to be a nurse in the late 30s in the Philippines, and during that period of time from 1898 to 1946, it was under American colonial rule. So her teachers were American or Western nurses. And how do I go to the next? And here you see my mom in the middle here, Elizabeth Diente. She is just graduated, also nursing school, 2 generations of nurses, heading to the Foreign Nurses Exchange Program, and for a 2-year program to visit the United States, learn about nursing. And a part of it that I found interesting is this foreign exchange program was created post World War II as a Cold War strategy to show democracy to other countries and import democracy to other countries, American values. Fast forward to 1970, my mom received a job offer at Joint Disease Hospital in Harlem, New York City, and Harlem, New York City, and with the H-1 visa, her and many other Filipino nurses. My dad followed her as a dependent, and this is them moving to Long Island City, Queens in 1971. And then 1976, I came along, and they purchased their first home in Woodside, Queens, where I'm making this presentation today. My background is in public arts, and one of the professional development programs I took was through the Laundromat Project, and where their mission is to make art, build a community, and to create change. And it was very instructive for me, and a community and a creative space. Another,
Also inspired by Rick
ooh,
Rose
sorry
and
about that
Project
noise.
Project Row has this.
Here are some examples of my work when I'm not working full time. I wanted to start to figure out how I could do more community art in my own neighborhood, or in at least the borough. I organized some Queens food forums where we went around to different MWBE restaurants, and then while we're eating delicious food, we're also talking about art. Those were a lot of fun. During events in Woodside, there was some mapping exercises, as you could see in this middle slide. And then we organized some walking tours in 2018 and 2019. Like the first one was in support from Flux Factory in Long Island City. And those were creative walking tours led by artists, musicians, and performers. So it's a very creative take on place and the neighborhood. Fond memories. So in 2020, Jacqueline Reyes and I, we submitted a proposal to the Laundromat Project for a public artist in residence program to be in Woodside. And I wanted to share that actual proposal from 2019 and just read it. So despite the 50 years of Filipino-American presence in that neighborhood, the dynamism of the community is oftentimes overlooked. With this residency, we envision a festival of public art interventions to build visibility and to engage in a series of community conversations with the Queens-based Filipino diaspora. This is with understanding that residents, nonprofits, businesses, and the arts could be a catalyst to co-create a vibrant neighborhood and collectively co-author the change we want to see in our community. And our project goals at the time was to showcase 5 key themes of Filipino arts and culture, to utilize public art to contribute to Little Manila's Queens reputation as a desirable place to live, work, and visit. We wanted to engage in community engaged design conversations and to empower the Philippine diaspora. Lastly, there's sustainability to encourage the private, nonprofit, and public sector to adopt and implement some of these future ideas. And this, if Philippine artists engage with local Philippine businesses, then the collective creativity of the community will be activated. If creativity is activated, then our collective histories, dreams, and realities will be visibilized. If our experiences are visibilized, then our communities can work towards catalyzing and healing and growth. So we were able to get the grant from the Laundromat Project, but then March 2020 happened, COVID-19. So we had to
2020.
pivot.
Elmhurst.
How do I
In
pause it?
March 2020.
Oh, sorry. So here's a map of Queens showing, it was dubbed as the epicenter of the epicenter. And here's where Little Manila is in relationship to Jackson Heights and Elmhurst. And so Jacqueline, with her background also in international disaster relief, knew that you can't talk about the arts if you can't address basic needs. So she learned about this program called Meal to Heal and adapted it for Little Manila because we were worried about our businesses closing down. And by organizing these food deliveries from the local restaurants to the frontline healthcare workers, we got deeper into community and learned more about, you know, some of these restaurants, you know, have multiple jobs. So if they're not at the restaurant, they're at the hospital. And the people who volunteered to deliver the food to mostly, you know, I guess second generation Filipino Americans like myself, we got to learn more about each other and our own immigration stories in different parts of the Philippines where their families were from. So Jacqueline was the first artist and she partnered with Amazing Grace. This wall is the main intersection of Little Manila, 70th Street and Roosevelt. This wall remained empty for several decades when under the previous owner, Crystal's Cafe, but under Amazing Grace, they said yes. And here are the staff from Amazing Grace, you know, during their breaks or low periods, helping with the painting of the mural. Here's the completed mural. And then we had an event with the local community, honoring and celebrating the frontline workers. One of the people that did attend was the former council member at the time, Jimmy Van Bremer, and he saw this plastic Little Manila sign that we had. And that he was inspired to share this quote of saying, "How I'm telling you today, as your council member, we will rename the street Little Manila and make this happen once and for all." So with, again, so much credit to Jacqueline, sorry, she can't be here today, but she had the foresight to, you know, quickly mobilize, pull together a campaign and a petition to gather 150 signatures. I also prepared an online petition that garnered over 3,000 signatures from all over the country and also 13 countries around the world. This is one part of that campaign. Here's a rendering of where that street sign would go.
The next
While we were doing this, we were continuing with commissioning artists. Since we couldn't do it as a festival because it's COVID, we did sequential public art commissions. Here's Cynthia Alberto doing a weaving activation, partnering with the K. Glen Sari Sari store, and then followed by Carl Orozco. He organized an installation along with the architect duo Almasphere, and you can see it on the right.
in fall 20.
Too bad I didn't delete. Here, the rise of anti-Asian discrimination was happening, and Queens Museum reached out to our group, inviting us to participate in a Queens Asian American Coalition. And Jacqueline was inspired and from all these different groups and made this participatory banner project. So over the course of the weekend, museum goers were able to participate and help paint these banners. And there was a vigil held. But we can't talk about all the projects. There was many projects, but just to give you a sense of like a wide range of approaches to, I guess, creative place keeping. There is video documentary, musical performances, food competitions, and yeah, a lot of range of things.
Our team is privileged to.
Sorry. We're honored to be participating as of 2021 with the Monument Lab that went on for 1 year with 10 teams across the country, highlighting the story of, or being inspired by the story of Tandang Sora. My apologies for the speaker.
The Tandang Sora.
So the Tandang Sora project hopes to illuminate the, I guess, migrant care labor, particularly and here in Queens, New York City. And we've been working on this project, I would say, for over 1.5 years now. We've gone past the initial support with the Monument Lab, and we're continuing developing conceptual designs that we will exhibit later this fall in Flushing Town Hall in Queens. A range of the parts of our, I guess, conceptual development ranges from sketches. We have an online website that has interactive multimedia story map. I guess it's going to be a part of a Monument Lab book. There was a initiative with a portrait gallery of care workers where oral histories were gathered and their relationship to place and care. And then storytelling, community journalism, and additional oral histories from the local businesses. And a term I've recently learning is legacy businesses. And there is going to be the hope of creating a large scale public activation or monument. This was just an exercise playing with my phone. It now has the ability to do these 3D LiDAR phone scans, and doing this in the neighborhood and just trying to document some of the businesses in the neighborhood. And then in March 2022, there was a week where 3 elderly Filipinas were attacked, and there was anti-Asian hate. So the Filipino community rallied together and organized this rally called Filipinos Rise Up. Jacqueline and our response was to make this Filipino women hyper visible in a way that doesn't center violence. So we made a 9-foot puppet. And doing the gesture called mana po, where basically a way to greet your elders is to put your forehead on an elder's hand. For that future exhibit later this fall, here's a concept sketch of one of the maquettes. I know I'm probably running out of time, but New York City has about 90,000 Filipinos, and in Woodside, there's about a 15% of the neighborhood are Filipino. Here's an initial map that shows the concentration of businesses, particularly around one block, but Filipino businesses are now in all 5 boroughs, but a significant cluster on one block. And then on the whole other historical arm, it's like the idea of New York being the empire state, and how both in the formation of the New York City and the 5 boroughs, formally in 1898, Philippines was also purchased along with Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, same year. I mentioned these stats. This is from the Department of Health showing, I guess, Filipinos by neighborhood, and you could see we're all over the borough, but there is a particular concentration around Woodside. This is the shape of Woodside. And this is from the research by Noah Allison, I guess a PhD candidate at the time, of that Roosevelt Avenue is a 5.8 mile long road. And he was proposing that this 5.8 mile long road under the 7 train is perhaps the most culturally diverse thoroughfare in the United States. And then he used GIS mapping to show these different ranges of restaurants along that 5.8 miles. Photos of Woodside, Queens. I guess after 1917, in response to this elevated train. And this is from the Filipino American National Historical Society, as well as my own family photos of Filipinos in Queens from the 1940s to the 1980s. My partner's family here in the 1950s, in the middle, and then here my mom in the bottom left. And this is more current. This is taken around 2020, showing more neighborhood existing photos.
This was another mapping project on.
Playing with History Pin, we added some, I guess, some of the buildings in there, and there was the opportunity to make a virtual walking tour. So if this QR code might still work if you want to try to scan it. And this is my last part. I don't know if I have time, but this is most recent. Just thinking through being so invested in Little Manila and Woodside, knowing that, I'll just jump ahead to this. The late Dr. Dawn Mabalon wrote Little Manila is in the Heart, and her book focuses on Little Manila and Stockton in California. But the last paragraph of her book does talk about and acknowledge the labor exportation and all the growing Little Manilas all over the United States and all over the world. And if I could read just this last sentence, the struggle over these buildings and space, the memory of this place is really a metaphor for the historical struggles of our larger Filipino American community and Asian American community to achieve social and economic justice, political power, real meaningful visibility in the United States. It is my hope that the love, respect, and commitment we feel for our historic community runs deeper than anything that could divide us. Little Manila will always be in our heart. And so basically I'm wondering how can we learn from other ethnic enclaves, or how can we learn from other Little Manilas of what their challenges are, what their wins are, and how they're doing it, how they're How are they surviving and thriving? And this is me just beginning to grapple with urban renewal and how it's impacted certain little Manilas. If they were built, earlier, they would be displaced or destroyed, and the communities that are created really near the highways because of urban renewal, because the land was inexpensive. This is a chart sketching out the concept of immigration waves of Filipinos. There's, I guess one scholar talked about it in 4 major waves, and here I'm showing 3 of them. The second major wave would be from the 1900s to the 1930s, and they're mostly in the West Coast. And then I'll just jump to in the 1940s to 60s, immigration was slowed down to almost a halt. There was 50 visas given a year for a number of years, and then 100 visas a year were given for a number of years. But then it exploded after 1960.
Popping up for a time call.
Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Xenia. And so at this point, I'd like to invite all 3 of our panelists to come back on screen. Great, good to see all of you again. So before we open it up to Q&A from the audience, I'd just like to have a little time for you all to respond to the work that you're each doing and hearing about the work that's happening in communities across the state. There are obviously a lot of common themes in terms of the communities that you're working in, the challenges that you're facing. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about what you see as some of the ways that you, are kind of going beyond the bounds of sort of traditional preservation practice, and maybe some of the things that you've learned from hearing about your colleagues' work in other communities. And I'll throw that out to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll go first. I love listening. I mean, I loved listening about everything with Little Manila when we met our first time, kind of figuring out what we were going to do for this presentation and everything. But seeing all of the stuff that you guys have been doing and all the ways that you've been trying to diversify and raise awareness of this community and for the outside community, but within your own community. And I think that brings up a really good point that for us as professionals doing this work, that there is always this very robust grassroots community member-led preservation work that often doesn't get labeled as preservation work, but everything that they are doing and she's doing with this group is, you're doing is exactly preservation stuff. You're raising awareness about the history. You're getting deeper into the context of the connection of this neighborhood with the surrounding area. You're helping document the evolution of the neighborhood. Like, it's very much preservation work. And so I think from us as the capital P preservationists, that we have to make sure that when, we usually come in when there's a success of grassroots groups like this that raise the awareness of this thing, and then magically someone got a grant, we come in and then we kind of just take it over and do the normal path of what preservation things that we do. So again, I think like hearing the stories of what's going on in Little Manila is that emphasizing that importance of we need to always be working with the actual community that lives in these neighborhoods and stuff. And then it's not always this top-down approach.
Yeah, that's really well said, Christine. I would agree with that as well. I mean, I think thinking about some of the biggest challenges we face in Newburgh of just for our project and, my own personal interest in preservation there is Newburgh is such a diverse community. And how do you engage in the city in a conversation about its built fabric when sometimes it's hard, it's kind of hard to figure out where to have a conversation and how you might structure that conversation and how you even talk about preservation. Is that even the right word to use? And I think that the examples today of just these real community-driven, I want to say art projects, but it's more like the community kind of come together and kind of create these happenings and these objects and these events. I mean, I think that figuring out, there's so much to learn there, I think, for Newburgh in terms of just how to seed the potentiality of a number of different ways for grassroots activities to happen.
One of the things I was struck by, Xenia mentioned or made a statement that, you know, before you can focus on art, you have to focus on, you know, the other issues that are affecting people's lives. And I think, you know, one of the common themes that, you know, is present in each of the communities that you all focused on, the east side of Buffalo, Newburgh, Little Manila, is, you know, there are communities that have faced a lot of challenges, disinvestment, redlining, you know, lack of resources, lack of attention from sort of the traditional capital P preservation community, and, you know, a lack of the use of those tools. You know, Liz, you're working in one of the biggest historic districts, but still facing this challenge of disinvestment, you know, in other places. Christiana, you noted that the west side of Buffalo has had a lot of attention from preservation, and the east side not nearly as much, and a lot of the challenges of demolition and loss of buildings and loss of integrity. So I'm curious for y'all to kind of like speak to that point as well, that, you know, how you get people to focus on preservation, and how you tie it to kind of these bigger picture issues and challenges that communities are facing, and highlight how, you know, preservation can be part of the solution to help move communities forward.
I love going first. I'll go first again. I mean, I think, and this kind of overlaps with one of the Q&A questions we'll get to, but there's a little bit of one of the questions that kind of overlaps with this about how you talk and communicate in the language that we use when we're out there doing these projects, whether it's the actual projects that we just talked about or just our general advocacy and outreach. But I think for me specifically, and what we've been trying to do here at PBN, is to always center our advocacy on the community, on the resource itself. Yes, we all learned these different criterias and rules and the things that we're supposed to follow. And we have this idea, yeah, this building is incredibly important and we want to save it. But is that what actually fits, and is that the needs and desires of that community that actually lives and has to live with that building on a daily basis, that uses that building regularly? Is that something that they value? Is it not something that they value? And understanding that. So we've always kind of centered our advocacy around, yes, utilizing and relying on these standard preservation practices and guidelines and things like that. But all of our work is centered on, what does that community want? What do they want to see in their community? What are they not able to make and create on their own? How can we use our privilege, our experience, our resources to empower them to be in charge of their own neighborhood and their own community, and not just constantly this top-down thing? So yeah, I mean, it's our language and how we go and talk to other people is incredibly important. You have to always center the people. That's why we're saving these buildings, so we can keep putting people in them for the future. So if we're not listening to the people who are currently or will be living in those areas, then what we're saving it for imaginary people for unknown reasons and things like that. So again, prioritizing around the current community.
Yeah, I'm continually humbled by our project, because I think there are times where we think, oh, we've got a great idea for how preservation could help the community. And then you meet the community and I'm kind of in awe of things that are already happening, or other initiatives. But I'll give an example of one thing we've been talking about the community. We've been thinking a lot about how to engage high school students and recent graduates who are in Newburgh, because there's a lack of jobs for these students. You know, there's no real transportation in Newburgh. It's hard to get to a job if you had one outside of the city. So we started to think about the fact that tourism in the Hudson Valley is hot. You know, Newburgh is being written about in the New York Times and other places as this destination to go visit. We were really interested in whether we could, through this walking tour program we started, whether we could come up with some program that would be a training for high school students that would apply, They get trained in doing walking tours and kind of set up their own businesses. And while this idea is still happening, it's been so hard to kind of figure out who, like the right people and players to talk to make this happen. You know, we've reached out to high school students and we don't want to extract information from them. Like, we're very curious about how they feel about preservation. So we were going to pay some students like a $25 an hour to sit down with us, which we thought was pretty impressive. Like, that would be our way of getting information about how people feel about buildings in the city. And that we haven't been able to kind of get that going. So I think there are a number of ideas that we have, and it's this constant back and forth and adjustment of figuring out, all right, well then, you know, our ideas we've got to get to the same point of figuring out how our efforts can help what the community at large would like to see happen. So I think for us, that's when our project pivots often, is kind of getting a clearer sense of the community's needs, the community's goals, and then realigning our efforts to match those.
Right. Go ahead. Xenia, no, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about what you were saying with the high school students. And when I think about it in relationship to temporary public art, when we're doing things, I've also faced difficulties when we try to reach out individually. And one thing that's worked for us is working with teaching artists. And the teaching artist provides that kind of vessel of whatever that, you know, inquiry is to help shape it and have that arc of an experience with the students.
That's great.
Yeah, whether teaching artists or the teachers at the local school. Yeah.
Great. That's a good segue to one of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So I'm going to start turning to those. So one of the attendees has said, you know, such fantastic and inventive outreach and public involvement in Queens, and specifically the Little Manila community. Did the projects rely on skills, mapping, et cetera, that people already knew, or were there organizations that helped with apps, software, et cetera?
The people who are stepping up and participating, they all have different talents and superpowers. That's all I've got to say. Yeah, I'm so impressed when I'm like learning more and about our community. Everybody's multi-talented and like lots of different skills and amazing singers, but I'm not one. But in terms of like the mapping or graphics, like there's the creativity, I guess, can get applied to like visualizations and the technical and the video and stuff. But yeah, I'm speaking as an artist, but yeah, there's technical people too that are architects and engineers.
I think it's also good to note that when it comes to like the technical stuff and those kinds of skills and things, that for those of us of a particular age, like current technology and programs and stuff are totally different than the mapping and other programs like that we used 5, 10, 15 years ago. So I think that right now you can have such dynamic and impactful programs like the Little Manila and other communities like that, because the programs are just a lot more user friendly and like the quality of those programs have improved, you know, like I think that a lot of people on this call, just because I know I see their newsletters and I see what they produce, there's a website called canva.com. It's like this, it's cloud-based, yeah, you're nodding your head, it's this cloud-based design thing. I've seen billboards going down the highway and I can tell that they use Canva to make that thing. And it's a graphic that would have before taken hours in Photoshop or in InDesign to make or something, where now 5 seconds, you have a really engaging poster that helps you get people at your community meeting. So I think we ought to remember that technology is always changing.
I'm going to turn to another question. Have you all, as community representatives, found it difficult to address preservation that is supportive of the municipality's residents and communities at a time when there is tons of money going from institutional investors like hedge funds into how to best make money off of our cities. Zoning codes, concepts, and input sometimes seem to be driven by those non-local interests, sometimes with local spokespeople, using inclusive, modern, and green language, but where demos and reuse can cause displacement, not reuse and rehab that support those who have historically lived in those neighborhoods. So kind of a question of, the investment and interest coming in from outside and how that interacts with the locally based communities that you're each working with.
I'd like to know how that impacts Newburgh, honestly, because I think that, like, just in general, we all kind of understand how it impacts New York City and the things that are going on with that. But I mean, is there a rush of are you begging developers to come and work on these? Like, are there developers coming to work on the shells? Like, is there a problem with people swooping in trying to take them? Your face answers the question right there.
Yeah, no, I feel like I can't give you a good answer to that. Yes, there are a lot of out-of-town developers coming into Newburgh. And I think the Hudson Valley in particular, experienced this in the post-COVID era of the prices in Newburgh have gone through the roof. Newburgh has other challenges. The taxes in Newburgh continually increase, which brings its own challenges for long-time home, forget about long-time, for any homeowner who's there, or even someone who is looking at buying a home there as an individual. So I think that there are certain economic forces in Newburgh that make it extremely challenging for an individual of modest to purchase a house there. So yes, there's a lot of outside investment that's coming in. I don't have a good answer other than for our project. I think it's just, but I think this is our personal approach. It's just being in the community and talking to people and finding out what's happening and making community collaborations. Like I gave a shout out to a lot of people in the presentation, but there are so many more who have been involved in our efforts. And I think that we see our project as being just one little piece of all of these other things that are happening in Newburgh, from projects that are cleaning up the Quissayet Creek to the oral history project that was funded by National Park Service of interviewing African Americans who were displaced by urban renewal. Like they're all of these little things, little amazing. Like I love this idea of like the superstars or in the community. And Newburgh has so many, and I think it's just kind of figuring out how you can all come together and and maybe, I don't want to say keep out the developers, but at least be able to have a voice in what Newburgh will be. And I think that's probably the biggest thing is all of the existing community groups kind of coming up with a vision or plan for what Newburgh could be, instead of being very reactionary to all the individual or for all the outside interests that are coming in, buying things up. We have a massive open urban renewal site in the city of Newburgh. And unless the community comes together and has a plan for what to do with that, then it will be very easy for an outside individual with a lot of money to maybe have their plan implemented. So I think that figuring out how we as a community can be better at proactively planning and thinking about what our needs are would be kind of critical for the city.
Liz, I'm going to follow up with another question directed to your work in Newburgh. So in the chat, there was a question from Julian Adams. There have been successful state and federal tax credit rehab projects at building shells in the East End District. Has that been used in your toolkit? And ties into a question that I had during your presentation. You mentioned 700 vacant buildings at a certain point in time, and then that number dropping down to 200. So is some of that, how much of that is demolitions and loss of historic properties? How much of that is rehab and reoccupation of those? So if you could kind of like touch on both of those points.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of it is rehab. There have been maybe 2 or 3 demos a year. It's kind of waned, but yeah, there are demos that certainly happen, but I think most of the numbers probably dropped because of rehabs. But I also do think the numbers dropped because I did mention like the challenge of measuring or counting vacancies. The metrics are always changing. So I think that number we probably weren't measuring apples to apples in how we counted in 2015 to how we counted today. So I think that would probably count for some of the disparity as well. But I will say it's a lot of rehab. We do mention tax credits in the toolkit. They're such an important tool, needless to say, for Newburgh in particular. So that's mentioned. And one of the things that we're doing this summer is we hope to have SHPO come and do a tax credit workshop at this porch project that we've created. And we've been looking at whether there are Spanish translations of the Secretary of the NPS Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, whether the tax credit applications are in Spanish. So we've just been kind of looking at some of the available resources and who has access to those in Newburgh.
Great. Okay, so a couple of questions from one audience member that I'll throw out. And I think they're kind of applicable to all of you, but this is very exciting. Do the presenters work with others doing similar work across the country? And if so, what are the forums you use? And do you find skepticism among residents when you approach them about deciding for their own neighborhoods? And do the cities where you work obstruct or work with you, or both? And how do you address that? So there's a number of questions there. Feel free, all of three of you, to jump in on whatever pieces you'd like to address. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I'll go. I'll always go
Christiana.
first. I hate silence. I physically laughed. I laughed about the part of the question of if the municipalities support you or not. I think that, well, first of all, yes, I think that there are similar projects exactly like what we're talking about here, maybe not carbon copies, but definitely very, very similar projects like what we're doing here all across the country. Making sure that you are, cued into the different, professional organizations, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, your statewide organizations. There's a lot of different like niche groups that focus just on revitalization or combating vacant buildings and stuff like that. Especially since the pandemic started, there's so many virtual webinars and conference opportunities now that I think I've learned more about what's happening around the country in the last 3 years than I ever did before going to every year's conference. So I definitely think that what we're doing here is representative of great work across the country. Skepticism all the time. I mean, here in Buffalo, I just gave you guys a crazy brief view of the damage that racism and segregation and all of these top-down racist planning programs have done to the city. That, when I started here 6 years ago, my executive director that I was working with had started about a year or two before me. That whole time was us building these bridges and repairing these broken relationships with an entire half of the city, because that side of the city has been taught that their opinion didn't matter, that preservation is about gentrification and pushing me out of my neighborhood and things like that. So we spent the last 6 years really focusing on making those connections and explaining to people and demystifying what it is that we're doing, and explaining that preservation in a bad way is used to do those things, but there are so many good things and supportive things that preservation could be used for. So I'm doing that constantly. And then, yeah, I definitely think there's times where the city obstructs what we're doing, not just in the city of Buffalo, but across Western New York, across New York. They want to support and create vibrant communities, but they also want to do what they want at their price point. And so you have all the time communities where you have a local landmark law, you're holding your, financially struggling homeowners to the standard of needing to follow these standards. And then sometimes the city allows all these big developers and other people to just go through without following that. So I definitely think there's a lot of inconsistencies in the city. And that's why, again, it's so important for us as those nonprofit, grassroots, whoever we are, entities, to always be constant with that narrative of what preservation can be, what it should be, and that building those relationships that we will make that happen. They're going to be against us no matter what, or we're going to have those challenges no matter what, but we got to stay that strong team together.
Yeah, Newburgh, we also have skepticism. There's so much skepticism. I also, I don't know the exact number of homeowners versus rentals in Newburgh, but when you talk to people who rent, the first question might be, what's in it for me? I don't own a building. I don't have kind of an investment in real estate here. So why preservation? And I think this is where there are a number of good projects that are happening in Newburgh, which are more about capturing the social history. The Urban Renewal Oral History Project kind of being a great example, but I think this emphasis on stories and really thinking about Newburgh's history, because sometimes people who come, they know there's an Olmsted Park, they know that A.J. Downing lived there, so there's kind of this moment in time of, let's say, the 1850s, where I think that's where people think Newburgh's grand architecture and history was made. But what's happened subsequently, and the people who are living in Newburgh and shaping it, I mean, it's such an incredibly vibrant place. And I think capturing the stories of the people who have lived here, from, let's say, when maybe the library records stopped around the 1930s, 1940s, like filling in this big gap that's missing in the city's social history, and that's missing in the East End Historic District designation report. It doesn't talk much about the African-American community. So figuring out, kind of focusing maybe less on what's in it for you as kind of like, you don't have to be a homeowner. Preservation matters to you, whether you're a homeowner or a rental and living in the community. So that's kind of one of the things that we're constantly working on, maybe to get over some of the skepticism or make it relevant.
One more question I'd like to pose to Xenia, and it's something that you mentioned in our prep call and in your presentation today, and it really struck me and struck a chord. This idea of friendship neighborhoods, building off the concept of sister cities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. Working in East Harlem, which is a focal point of the Puerto Rican community and one of the hubs of the Puerto Rican community in the United States. Doing research and surveying to identify and celebrate, spaces that are important in East Harlem has been a big focal point. And so I'm curious how many connections you've been able to make so far to other little Manilas around the country, and where you see that concept going, because it really resonated with me as a way to kind of tie together what you've been doing in Little Manila in Queens, but to other Filipino communities that have grown up over the decades in other cities around the country.
I would say there's been, I've noticed some advancement this past 2 years. Like for example, in Soma Pilipinas in San Francisco, they had a historical designation of the whole neighborhood. And because they had that historical designation, that then allowed the local nonprofit there, I forgot the full name, Cultivate Labs, to provide all kinds of nonprofit services, to be incubators, to support legacy businesses, to support artists, like a whole range of a suite of creative / economic development, supporting the Filipinos that are there, as well as the kind of history there. And yeah, because Filipinos in the West Coast, there are now 5 generations living in the United States. Whereas here in New York, it's more like first and second generation. There's those different experiences, and I just love that when we're learning about Little Manila, a lot of the conversation is about being hyper local, but if you're going to dig deep into a Filipino or I guess any recent immigrant group, you're also talking transnational, and you need to understand, or it's good to begin to learn about all the history and language and where there's 0 bridges. So I don't think I'm exactly answering your question, but for the Filipino community, since there's been a lot of exportation of labor since the 1960s, I think there's this global network, especially with Facebook, of the interconnectedness of the Filipinos that had to leave and live in different countries, and now they're connected in Facebook. Yeah, I'm still not answering your question, but like it's, I guess, a part about hardware versus software, like those go hand in hand. Like if hardware is like what you're preserving, I guess the software is all this social stuff. It's what you're trying to support. And yeah, it's dynamic.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that absolutely answered the question, and I appreciate that. Now I have another, in addition to friendship neighborhoods, hardware and software is another great concept that I'm gonna like keep in mind, because I think that really, you know, boils down like this, what we're talking about today, and you know, the future of preservation in urban spaces. It's, you know, it is the physical space, it is the places that we inhabit. You know, whether high architecture, vernacular architecture, spaces that are missing because of disinvestment and loss, and you know, all those things that we've been talking about. But it really is the thing that ties it together is the community, whether the local community or the community that is connected to other similar communities around the state, around the country, around the world. I think that's a great note to end on. So I think we are at time. So I see Katie is reappearing to help us close out. So just thank you to the panelists. This has been really great. I've learned so much, and I hope that our audience has as well. You're all doing amazing work, and it's been great to hear from you and speak with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for moderating. To the panelists, thank you so much for sharing the work that you're doing. Does anyone have any last minute thoughts that you would like to leave us with before we say goodbye today?
Thank you for having us. Thank you for letting us meet each other and learn more about each other.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We do these webinars fairly frequently, and we hope you'll join us for another one someday soon.
Bye.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.